First of all, the first step is to be aware that I need to take action. The big picture will revolve around generative AI, and I think this will be the case for a long time to come. The most important thing is to start by taking inventory and establishing your own governance for your company. Ultimately, it's about responding appropriately to the risk.
Yes, dear listeners, we are back again today with our podcast, Digital Decoding. Here's the news. Today we have a guest, and in this case, I'm very pleased to warmly welcome Olga Stepanova. Olga is a partner at the law firm ByteLaw. You'll certainly introduce yourself again in a moment, and we're also looking forward to discussing the topic of the EU AI Act with you today. Yes, Olga, you are truly a recognized expert. Please be so kind and briefly introduce yourself.
Yes, with pleasure. Thank you very much, Mario. I'm very happy and excited to be here today. As you already mentioned, I am the founder of the law firm ByteLaw, a firm in the heart of Frankfurt am Main that specializes exclusively in digital topics. By now, with 7 attorneys, we handle everything from data protection to IT law, but especially the new IT regulations, which regularly come to us from Brussels and are giving us more and more work, including, among other things, the AI regulation. Otherwise, about myself, I am a certified specialist lawyer for IT law and for intellectual property law, and especially in the field of AI. These two areas of expertise often intersect.
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Olga, for the introduction. As I said, we're really looking forward to this because it's obviously a top topic that you deal with every day, and I assume you have a lot of work at the moment. Maybe since none of us are legal experts, it would be great, and that's how I know you, that you could translate things for us again. Could you briefly explain to us what the EU AI Act actually is overall? Maybe just in a few simple sentences so that everyone can understand it.
Yes, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So, first of all, it's a European regulation. That means this law applies equally in all 27 EU member states. So it doesn't need to be translated into, say, German law again, as is the case with NIS2, for example. This is ultimately legislation that was already underway before the big hype around ChatGPT. And of course, the use of generative AI has brought it even more into focus. Ultimately, this is a product safety standard in this context. That means it's about ensuring that AI does not cause harm to people or to economic assets, to people's property through its use. Because ultimately, like a bread knife, AI can be used for a wide variety of purposes. And to ensure that everything is properly regulated within an appropriate framework, the AI Act is being introduced. And now it exists, and it will gradually come into effect more and more each year.
Yes, this is a really fascinating topic, Olga. First of all, a warm welcome from my side as well. And as Mario just mentioned, Mario and I are not legal experts, but of course this topic comes up in many customer conversations, and you already pointed out NIS2 and so on. We will come back to that later. What I'm interested in at this point is that this is an EU law published at the EU level. From your perspective, why is it necessary at the EU level? And maybe a follow-up question right away. How are your clients actually reacting to this new law?
Well, I think that especially in our highly digital world, it makes little sense to create legislation for such a far-reaching area solely for France or Italy, because of course you sometimes hear people say, well, in the US everything is unregulated and I can do whatever I want there, and that stifles progress. If you were to regulate this only at the level of individual member states, it would also become an issue of competitive disadvantages. For example, if the Netherlands had no regulations in this area, you might start to wonder, does it make sense to run the entire business out of the Netherlands? Then the question arises, which principle applies? So if I offer this to a member state that, for example, already has AI legislation, they might take a protectionist stance and apply the market principle, saying, well, if this is being offered to Italian citizens or companies, then our AI legislation still applies. That means, in my view, we need to move away from the understanding that we are many, many different member states, at least when it comes to the digital sector. We see ourselves as a single market, Europe as a unified market in which uniform rules must also apply so that we can deal with the issue in the best possible way.
And how are your clients responding to the new law? What kind of feedback are you getting? Or is it more cautious, more of a wait and see approach? How should I picture that, Olga?
To be honest, I have to say that some have already implemented AI projects that go beyond the use of classic generative AI, like the well-known chatbots, so to speak. Many see this as a great opportunity, but others also feel pressured by the fact that competition is, of course, being greatly intensified by AI as a technology. They feel compelled or under pressure to implement corresponding AI tools, let's call them that, in their companies so as not to fall behind. This naturally leads to an increased need for advice, both on the company side and on the consultant side. And ultimately, it has to be said that I naturally save a lot on expenses, perhaps on resources, thanks to AI. So at least in my experience, I haven't really encountered anyone complaining heavily that we're over-regulating everything here in Europe. I think that for many, it's actually seen more as an opportunity. And what's also an interesting point is that, especially when you advise a lot of different companies in this field, you can, of course, without naming clients or anything like that, draw on a certain wealth of experience from your consulting work and say, well, other companies have had this or that use case. Maybe that's something for you as well. And I think that this also helps shape a consultant profile and that companies overall feel quite well supported, that someone is there to help and assist them with AI, not just in terms of what they have to comply with under the AI regulation, but also in a very practical sense, what else can they actually use AI for in general?
And that's an interesting topic in itself, Olga, because I don't know, as you just described, many people aren't really reacting, how should I put it, in a panicked way. But what I do notice is that there is still a lot of ignorance. And of course, this ignorance exists because many people, including myself, by the way, haven't really engaged intensively with this regulation. And if you start to engage with it a bit, you also learn about the different risk classes of systems. And I think that's really, really important. Maybe you could give us an impression or some insight into what these risk classes actually mean for companies in the end.
Well, basically, you first have to make a fundamental statement. In all digital legislation, whether it's the GDPR, NIS2, DORA, the Cyber Resilience Act, or even the AI regulation, a very important principle is established, which is the same across all the laws just mentioned, the so-called risk-based approach. That means you look at how high the risk is when using XYZ, what is associated with it, and how you can appropriately address this risk. And it's similar here, as I just mentioned, with the bread knife. You can use the bread knife to cut bread, but you can also use it to cause harm to the body or health, as a lawyer would say, of another person. Which conversely means, when thinking about AI, that I can, of course, use AI for very, very different purposes, even for something as simple as a regular chatbot. So in the end, it's about addressing the risk appropriately. There are purposes that are prohibited. For example, things like real-time surveillance in public spaces with biometric linkage, so that I know exactly when Mr. Müller or Ms. Myers walk down Bockenheimer Landstraße in Frankfurt am Main. Those are situations that as a society in the European Union we do not want to have, which is why, for example, the use of AI for such purposes is prohibited. Then, of course, there is a high-risk area. These are areas, especially in the medical field, but not exclusively, where the use of AI could potentially cause harm to the physical well-being or lives of individuals. And that's why I have to pay special attention to ensuring that the AI is well trained, that everything is well documented, how I trained this AI, so that I have at least reduced the risk of something like that happening to an acceptable level. Then, of course, there is also AI with transparency requirements. These are typically, for example, I recently gave a talk on AI in journalism where, for instance, if I create deepfakes, I add a note stating that this was generated with the help of AI. And those are roughly the differences depending on the purpose I use it for, the AI, so to speak, as a versatile tool. Accordingly, I have to consider appropriate precautions, which actually makes perfect sense.
Dear Olga, we've talked a lot about risks now. Both of us are children of the Ruhr area, which means we're more the hands-on types who enjoy things and see opportunities. Yes, of course, I'm also interested in where you see the greatest legal uncertainties in the context of AI and what are the typical pitfalls for companies.
Well, I think ultimately, especially from a doer's perspective, it's wise not to close yourself off to the progress that's coming, but rather to make good use of this progress for yourself, your company, and your company's customers. Certainly, one must keep in mind that the AI regulation is only one aspect. And to be honest, for the vast majority of clients, with certain exceptions, the current focus is very much on the use of generative AI. That means I have different providers, Microsoft Copilot, ChatGPT, Gemini, and thousands of others, and I simply need to be aware of what I actually want to use all of this for, because we very often see that people want to use AI, but at the same time don't define what the use cases are. On the other hand, you can't ignore the fact that even if I don't yet have an AI policy in my company, I can be quite sure that many employees in my company are already using some form of application without regulation, so to speak, in the absence of such an AI policy. So my first point, where I would talk about major stumbling blocks and problems, is to first look at and identify where AI is currently being used in the company at all. Because from my perspective, the really big stumbling block is that people aren't even aware of it. On the one hand, of course, you could say, well, we've now approved XYZ chatbot. But you also have to keep one important thing in mind, and we'll see this more and more in the coming months and years, that providers of completely standard software, whether it's accounting, CRM, or something else, are now also starting to integrate AI elements, and that's something I also need to take into account. That means first comes awareness and second is governance, putting in place appropriate regulations, such as an AI policy to protect management from liability. For example, defining whether personal data may be used. Yes or no? Am I allowed to feed in company or trade secrets, so to speak? Yes or no? And of course, that will largely depend on whether the AI is, so to speak, open. Is it an AI that I operate on premises? There are 1,000 different possibilities, but the first step is to be aware that I need to take action.
Olga, I have a follow-up question about that. Earlier, you already mentioned all the regulations a bit. NIS2, DORA, Digital Services Act, and so on and so forth. What was touched on in passing, and you picked up on the journalism example, is copyright and usage rights, yes. And I think that's a really important topic. If I create a website or if I sell a website to a client that I didn't actually write myself but had written by ChatGPT, and I also generate the images, what do I need to pay attention to?
That's an incredibly important point, and I think it's great that you're bringing it up again, because there's one thing you mustn't forget. AI itself, according to the first legal rulings we now have in Germany, especially from Hamburg, does not create copyrights, or at least not in such a way that I am able to transfer usage rights or exploitation rights to copyrights. The idea behind copyright is that I, as a human, create a work through my act of intellectual creation, and that's what's missing with AI. That means if I, as a media agency, sign a contract with a company and tell them, well, we're going to program a website for you, write all the text, provide you with the images, and grant you the rights of use and exploitation for the copyrights that we, as a media agency, create for you. But in the end, it's debatable at least how much of that is actually generated by AI or not. But especially with images, when they come from Midjourney or similar tools, they're 100% AI generated. In that case, I'm actually breaching the contract because I'm not even able to grant these rights of use and exploitation for the copyright, since these works, so to speak, lack copyright protection.
I'd also like to follow up on that because, as you said, it's a super important point and it's something almost everyone is dealing with. We have a different situation, and that's something I'd like to know more about. If, as an IT company, we create a solution that uses generative AI or even advanced AI, let's say, for example, OpenAI based on Azure, and we develop our own prompting there, which is the biggest part, in fact, the most valuable IP in such a solution. How does that work in this case? Can I protect something like that?
It's exactly the same. Legally speaking, code that is programmed is also subject to copyright, which arises from it. That is also considered a work under copyright law. And if you code it or I code it, then it's a creation, a human intellectual creation, and is initially protected by copyright.
Okay.
The only question is, how much artificial intelligence or AI do I actually use for that? That means if I simply have the artificial intelligence check whether there are any vulnerabilities or issues in my code, then that's one thing. But if I have the AI code everything from start to finish, then that's a different matter. And in between, there is a huge gray area that is only now slowly being clarified by the first court cases. However, in my legal argumentation, I would always refer to whether most of it, the idea behind it, and essentially the execution was created by a human or by the AI, and whether the AI was merely a tool to, so to speak, improve the code, or if it was actually responsible for the main task.
Great, Olga. I'd like to briefly shift topics and now really move on to implementation and governance. You already mentioned earlier that there are different risk classes and that there are, first of all, transparency obligations and documentation requirements. But from your perspective, what do companies need to do to properly document AI risks? And how verifiable does all of this ultimately need to be? I believe the regulation will come fully into effect in 2026, but how can companies already start preparing to do the right thing?
So I think it will essentially depend on what I as a company actually do. I'll just speak for the vast majority of companies now, and most companies are dealing with questions in the area of generative AI. I would say that certainly here in Germany, as an industrial location, there will be some companies that use AI in other ways as well, but most will initially be dealing with Copilot and other chatbots, so to speak. And I think the biggest thing, this is what I just mentioned as well, will be first of all to identify where I have AI everywhere. And as a company, to define use cases for myself, essentially as a whitelist and blacklist. What do we want to use AI for, and what do we not want to use it for, just to show it with an example. The first thing you should think about at this point, after conducting an inventory and knowing where AI is intended to be used in my company, is to first introduce an AI policy to ensure that my employees handle it properly. Because especially with generative AI, the biggest issue doesn't actually come from the generative AI itself, but rather from what I feed into it. For example, so if I have an AI that basically runs openly, meaning all my prompts are transmitted to a provider's servers and processed there, I need to be sure that this doesn't affect any data protection obligations, that I don't violate any patents, trademarks, or copyrights, and of course, that I don't disclose any trade secrets from my company. I think that's the most important thing I should do at this point to protect myself as a company, and also to keep checking whether new use cases arise so that I can update these use cases as needed, ensuring that I always stay up to date with the whole matter. Very few companies will operate in the high-risk sector because ultimately the big picture will revolve around generative AI, and I think that will be the case for a long time to come. And of course, another topic is that I will certainly have dedicated compliance requirements from the AI regulation, such as the fundamental rights impact assessment for high-risk AI systems. It has to be said, this is something we already know quite well from the GDPR when we carry out particularly risky data processing, that we also have to conduct a data protection impact assessment. In other words, it essentially comes down to documentation obligations, which I don't want to go into in detail now because they aren't really relevant for that many companies. The most important thing is to start by taking inventory and establishing your own governance for your company in this area.
I have a question that goes beyond governance from my point of view. Like, as a company ourselves, we naturally want to make AI available to every employee. Yes, as you mentioned, a lot of this is already happening. For example, we ourselves use Copilot, but also other tools or even OpenAI, depending on the role. Interestingly, you also notice, and André and I want to touch on this again, when you use the standard Copilot and then the classic full version of Open, I get much, much better results. And on the other hand, it also depends on the models. And what I'm also interested in is, of course, the question, do you use it yourselves? And I'm also curious, are there any special regulations that apply to you as a law firm?
Yes, that's a very good question. And of course, it's relevant because at this point, you also have to consider that AI is not only going to change industry in some way, but certainly also the legal profession. And yes, we actually got Copilot, I think about a year ago, when it was still very, very new. Simply from the perspective that we want to support our clients well, not just with individual legal questions, but also because we get a lot of questions like, how do you use your Copilot, or is there a new feature, and so on. And essentially, it was about making sure that we have the appropriate licenses so that Copilot, when used for work, only operates in chat on your own data mode. That means it accesses only our own data and no data is transferred beyond that. From my point of view, that's important. And the other thing that's important, of course, comes from the professional regulations for lawyers. Now I'm going to get a bit nerdy here. Section 43E of the Federal Lawyers Act, which states that we must also obligate our service providers to meet the specific needs of lawyers. And that's exactly what we've done with our service provider.
And Olga, there's a question that's really burning on my mind, since you also use this yourselves, which I find very exciting, by the way, because I remember a conversation I had about 2.5 years ago, also with a law firm. Back then, it was absolutely out of the question. God forbid, we couldn't possibly allow that in the context of our clients. But what I'd be really interested to know is, have you ever had one of those aha moments yourself where you thought, wow, this really makes a lot of what I have to do easier or speeds up a lot of my work?
Well, I think it's important to always remember that the lawyer is ultimately responsible and Copilot will never be able to do what the lawyer does. And that's why the whole discussion about AI replacing all of us, I don't see it that way at all. I see it more as AI replacing tasks that are not very creative, in quotation marks, but the actual consulting service will always remain with the lawyer. What I really like now are two newer features in Copilot. One is the research agent, where answering the prompt might take approximately 5 or even 10 minutes, but you receive information that is backed by very solid and reliable sources. And the other is the notes or notebook function, where I can create a notebook, upload documents into it, and then instruct the AI to base its answers exclusively on these documents in order to prevent it from pulling in additional sources.
Dear Olga, I don't want to be a spoil sport, but we're almost at the end. So you've got me hooked. I also thought the exchange was really, really good because, as you said, it wasn't overly nerdy at all. Now I have one final question. What do you recommend to companies? After all, we primarily make this podcast for companies and decision makers, so they can prepare well in advance for the obligations starting in 2026. What are the 3 or 4 key points?
From my perspective, it still comes down to this, because I see it so often in consulting. You need to do a proper inventory. And that doesn't just mean looking at which chatbots you're using, but especially where AI elements are now being integrated into your standard software, which these days are often included by default, so to speak. That's the first big point. And the other thing, and there's really no way around this, even if you're subject to different legislation, is of course the implementation of a proper risk management system, especially in the area of highly regulated companies like those we advise in the banking sector. You can see that a lot is already in place, of course, which can also serve as methodology for the AI regulation and other legislation. In this area, you can adopt a lot because a risk management system is already in place. You just need to adapt it a bit to the specific needs. But fundamentally, IT security and other topics are handled exclusively through this risk-based approach. Therefore, you definitely need to establish your own risk management. And in the end, especially for companies that are perhaps exclusively active in the field of generative AI, the risks might be considered relatively low, so you may not need to implement many mitigating measures. In contrast, other companies will have much more to do in this regard. So start now, don't wait until the very last minute to do everything, because that will only increase the pressure to implement at the end, and you might still have the opportunity to adapt or further develop certain business processes. So it definitely doesn't make sense to wait until the very last possible moment to implement.
Great, thank you very much. Then I'll try to briefly summarize a few important points as a closing statement. So, first of all, none of us should be afraid of AI nor of complying with the legal regulations. Secondly, of course, we all have to fulfill the documentation requirements, but we should also consider, ideally with the help of ByteLaw, for example, how we can do this in the leanest and most efficient way possible. Thirdly, we've heard from you about risk assessments and risk classes. As you mentioned earlier, Olga, you really have to think carefully in advance about what you actually want to use AI for and what you need for that. And of course, that can also help to avoid having to regulate so much later on. Another point, security measures. That means you also have to keep an eye on that accordingly. Roles and permissions are, of course, always an issue. I need to define and limit them in such a way that not everyone can see everything. I think that's something you have to do regardless of AI, but it always gets lumped together with AI. At the end of the day, though, it's something I have to do in general. Roles and permissions are always, I would say, easily forgotten. I also have to provide enablement. You mentioned training, and AI literacy could also be included here. Of course, I need transparency about what information is available, what it can be used for, and it's also important to inform users about the risks involved so that they are willing to engage. And I personally take away from this, so don't be afraid. Of course, there are things that need to be observed, and on the other hand, yes, there are liability risks, but those can also be limited. But if you put yourself in good hands, and I can personally only recommend ByteLaw and not just personally Olga, then you'll always find ways to make things work, even for medium-sized companies.
With pleasure. Thank you very much for the good and very accurate summary. I really enjoyed it today.
Thank you very much. Also from my side.
Yes, thank you very much. And with that, we hope you enjoyed it again. Today, for the first time with a guest, I hope André and I did a good job as well. It's a premiere for us too, and of course we hope we were able to share something practical with you. Tune in and also let us know what are the topics that matter to you. Give us your feedback as well. You are welcome to contact both Olga and us about this important topic and also engage in an exchange with us. Yes, otherwise all that's left to say is stay human and have a great day.